Why farm organic?
So I would say if you look at it fundamentally, economically, year over year, across Canada, in other regions, organic production systems have a lower cost of production and a greater gross profit per acre, leading to greater ROI. If we already grow more than enough food to feed every person on the world many times over right now, but we still have hunger, increasing production isn't going to mean that there's more or less hungry people. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of organic producers who are running nutrient budgets over their rotation. There was never one example yet that I've seen where a poor farmer became a good farmer by taking away tools out of their toolbox. Now that I think we see more producers finding technological ways to share and also expressing greater willingness to share. Your failures are shared. Your successes are shared. Your books are shared. Your profitability is shared. That with the right people, you can be open and transparent and work together and collaborate so that all of our operations can be better in a myriad of different ways. If you, as a producer, don't like an element of our regulatory environment, you can make a strong and convincing case as to why a particular subset of the regulation should be changed. We cannot use biology and plants alone to fix the problems.
Is there a special bond? Is there a club? Do you got a tattoo in some place we can't see that says organic?
The first rule of the club is, not to talk about the club. So for our farm, they're very committed for us to be trying to innovate, that they want to see us use new technologies, new ideas, and new products, not innovation for the sake of innovation itself, but innovation that addresses some of the challenges that are out there.
Welcome to the Growing the Future podcast, where future is always bigger than our past. Brought to you by Aberhart Ag Solutions. And I'm your host, Dan Aberhart. In Season 2, Episode 10, Greg Cooper and I talk to Stuart McMillan of Legend Organic Farms about all things organic agriculture. Enjoy.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story about show business, and it's a good life lesson for all of us. Just thinking about you getting set up to do the podcast here. But do you know why Motley Crue had in their rider to play at different events, they had the stipulation that they had to have brown M&Ms in the dressing room?
No.
So the story is that every rider for the different tours that they're on, they had a stipulation for brown M&Ms in the dressing room, because if the brown M&Ms were in the dressing room, they knew that the people putting on the event had read the contract in detail and everything was going to go smoothly at the show. If they did not, obviously, they had to circle back and have a conversation. So as we prepare for
season, even address the brown M&Ms, you know that they may not be addressing the other critical parts of the performance and all of the other technical requirements.
Well, and I think that's a brilliant thing that you got to give them a lot of credit for, and something we can use in all of our personal and professional lives, just to catch if people are paying attention and make sure that you're prepared. So, Stuart McMillan, welcome to the Growing the Future podcast. How are you doing there today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be on the podcast today.
Awesome. So we're going to cover some interesting ground, but we also have another special guest host, co-host, if you will, his first time. It's Greg Cooper with us, account manager for Aberhart Ag Solutions out of Saskatoon. How are you doing today, Greg?
Good, Dan. Thanks for having me on here. It's been on a webinar before, but never this famous, so I'm excited.
Oh, man. Like I was saying, we got tens of viewers that are just hunched over their devices waiting for the next Growing the Future podcast. But for us here at Aberhart Ag Solutions, it's their second call with an organic producer today. So that's awesome. It's getting to be a bit of a trend on Zoom to be an organic producer. But I want to cover lots of ground today with you, Stuart, as an individual in the organic farming production. line here, but I wanted to go back. I was looking at your LinkedIn. You have quite the education, Stuart. So just to give the audience a little bit of context, you are currently the farm manager at Legend Organic Farms at Kamsack, Saskatchewan. So that's going to be largely the part of our content.
Yeah, coming on our third growing season here coming up now. So that's very exciting.
Right. So let's just go back in time and learn a little bit more about you, and then we're going to get more into the operations of Legend Organic. That sounds cool to you?
Sure. Yeah.
So I was looking here, and you are you studied at the University of Manitoba. You got a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and Agroecology, and you're on the Dean's Honor Roll. I love that. But what really piqued my interest is you were a DJ on student radio for 4 years, my man. Tell me, you're a DJ?
Well, the willingness to do an impromptu webinar probably is influenced a little bit by that. Definitely could be a little bit influenced by that. Yeah, no, it was a talk radio show host though. So the idea of jumping into a studio and talking about, exploring a topic is not something I'm unfamiliar with. So that me and my hosts had a talk radio piece that was looking at the environment, agriculture, and current issues. So I'm hoping that there are no audio recordings still in existence. One thinks back to content they may have created 2 decades earlier, and may have thought maybe it wasn't quite as polished. Maybe it wasn't quite as nuanced as one's perspective is in their mid-40s as it may have been in their mid-20s.
So you were podcasting before there was podcasting. What did that teach you?
Well, preparation is probably a very important key for successfully orchestrating a good radio content. But if you don't have the benefit of preparation, then you can rest on your laurels of creativity and just letting it ride. Definitely was a lesson learned.
Well, and to be fair to you, Stuart, today just the audience knows you took this completely impromptu and we're just rolling. You have no idea what I'm going to be asking you or what we're going to be talking about. So The beauty of it. I see here that you not only studied at the University of Manitoba, got a Bachelor of Science there, but you got a Master's in Science at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, and you were looking at entomology and molecular ecology and agroecology. What is that all about?
Right. So, I mean, it's a curious question that we have, is that beneficial insects eat pest insects. This is going back to, prior to Darwin, where, they were releasing ladybugs to control aphids in hop production in the 1700s in England. So that idea of, lady beetle eats aphid is not new. And obviously, that was just the first recorded example of using biocontrol for a crop pest. What gets more nuanced is which lady beetle eats which aphid at what frequency, at what times, and what is that? What is the details of that predator-prey relationship? That's where it gets a little more tricky. So classically in ecology, if you want to know who eats what, now you can go build a blind and see, does the lion eat how many gazelles per day? Or you could say, go catch a seal, kill it, cut open its belly, and look inside to say, how many fish does the seal eat? And which fish does it eat in which area? Now imagine doing either A or B with a lady beetle and an aphid.
Did you watch Tiger King?
I have not watched it yet. No, I haven't watched it yet. It's on our to-do list before seeding gets ramping up here.
Little did we know that we would spend the month of April 2020 watching some really eccentric people and their big cats on television, quarantined.
Yeah. So the curious part on the idea of predator-prey relationships that I was looking at, and that I think a lot of ecologists were looking at, is finding a quicker and easier way, because people did, and people do actually capture a lady beetle, cut open its belly, and look for the indigestible parts of an aphid. And now you can imagine that level of precision that is required in this, a level of anal attention to detail to be looking for the one indigestible part of an aphid that is still in the belly of a lady beetle. This is also prone to a little bit of error because you're dealing with something so ludicrously tiny. So it's a much more interesting way is to actually use PCR and use molecular ecology and actually just look for DNA tracers that you can say, all right, can you not just take a insect question, whir it up, gel it up, and run it through PCR to look for the DNA of who it's been eating? And so then you could find out, well, which one eats which, which insect eats which pest under which conditions, and do that a lot more quickly and easily and accurately.
Greg, is this something you and your buddies would be interested in doing on the weekends?
Well, that's what I was going to ask, Stuart. I know a lot of people in our industry have, a passion about one specific topic or maybe multiple. Was this something that you were into in your younger age, in high school or younger? Did you have a bug collection?
No, I did not. And in fact, entering agriculture, my father, who also had been a U of M ag grad, had told me, son, I got one piece of advice for you. There are three groups of people in ag school you need to look out for: chicken heads, the entomologists, and the soil scientists. I said, but Dad, you're a soil
look out
scientist.
for soil scientists.
In soil science. And you're telling me not to associate with the soil scientists? He's like, no, don't. They're a bunch of weirdos. So no, he cautioned me on two of my passions, which are insects and soil science and soil fertility. I've never had much of an enthusiasm for chickens, so maybe I've taken that one to heart.
That's awesome.
That's really fascinating. So are you able to apply some of the things that you learned at these esteemed schools around the world to what you're doing today in CAMSAC?
I think for any producer are balancing the front and center issues of getting the crop in, addressing all of the challenges that we have on the farm on a day-to-day basis, managing the staff, and doing that tempers some of our curiosity projects. So I would say that many of my curiosity projects, because we are still a relatively new farm who is still, real phase of establishment, have had to be put a bit on the back burner. But they are ones that I will think about. Say, for example, Agriculture Agri-Food Canada reached out to us to look to maybe do a farm-based trial of establishing some warm season clovers, both subterranean clover and crimson clover, in with our cereal crops. And the principal question was, would establishing these warm season clovers as an understory in a cereal crop, A, help with weed control, B, help with providing some nitrogen, and which should lead to increased yield and increased plumpness or grain quality parameters. When I thought about this, it did go through my head. I thought, if I'm putting in a flower, a source of nectar and pollen as an understory, that will promote my beneficial predatory insects. That should improve ground beetles. It should improve rove beetles. Those are two good generalist predators who would benefit from having a pollen and a nectar source that would also help control cereal aphid, rose cherry oat aphid. So I thought, could I do that as a little side project if we establish this? Could I look to see, is my abundance of beneficial insects greater in my polycrop or my mixed crop cereals as opposed to my monocrop ones? So one always wants to try to explore some of those questions. It's just always a bit of a challenge to try and find the time in the day to do all those things that might be a curiosity or a passion.
It sounds like you're very granular in your focus. Would you say that you're very technical versus painting with broad strokes?
I think one has to try and strike a balance between those, the core questions that one has that I think any producer has and needs to focus on. Does this pencil out? Does this provide better yield? Does this provide greater quality? And some of the more nuanced questions of, does this address some of the secondary questions that we have in agriculture? Trying to fight that balance, I think, is what all producers can struggle with or have a challenge in.
Yeah, I'd be really curious what's going through, I guess, not to take anything away from it, but your average conventional producer listening to you talk, the level of detail you're thinking about these interactions, I'm not sure if on an average day on top of paying the bill at the local inputs retailer and greasing the tractor and working with the banker and the accountant and the employees and the government and like all the things you got to do in a day, if they're thinking about some of these more finer points of interaction in nature? And if so, is the ROI there as some of the people in your camp are challenging you?
Well, I mean, I'm freed up from having a question of, is there a residual carryover from, this group of herbicide I applied last year on this product that's going to impact on this year's crop? How do I effectively rotate my groups of herbicide so I'm, mitigating and managing resistance? So I think we end up, when you don't have to think about one thing, it does free your mind up to thinking on the other side. So there is perhaps I would never say that I have a greater complexity than my conventional neighbors. I would say we just have different complexities that we're delving into.
As complicated as our world has got, we thought it was going to be like the Jetsons and everything would be relatively simple. We'd just be going around in our flying cars by 2020, but seems the world's more complicated than ever. So what was in the summer of 2003, what was your key takeaway at the Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada?
Right. So I guess part of my curiosity that both led me into U of M and over to Sweden and eventually into the Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada was that, well, I've been passionate about organic in the early 90s. As much as I explored areas around it, there really seemed to be an idea that A, organics lacked any sort of credibility, that B, it was a rejection of science, knowledge, and technology, and some sort of a Luddite return back to farming hundreds of years ago. It really, and those two things of A and B really meant that it had, no credibility, no interest, and wasn't even worthwhile in pursuing. So I really wanted to look towards seeing, is there science behind some of the concepts being used by organic producers? Is there a benefit that's, are there benefits that can be quantified? Is there anything tangible that can really drive this? Or is it, just responding to ill-informed consumer interest and therefore not really worth exploring? So absolutely, that's what kind of led me as a bit of my journey into trying to look at the sound basis to some of the production methods and to the system as a whole. So I think where I found sort of interesting was the OACC's ability to collaborate with both universities within Canada and then also internationally with other research foundations that are kind of really been at the cutting edge of quantifying the science of organics and bringing them into a Canadian context.
I'd like to build on something you said there, Stuart. You talked a lot about assumptions and the different practices that organic growers do. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of assumptions made by conventional growers or anybody in the industry on what are those practices. Is there a trend of seeing, more guys are polycropping or more guys are tilling? What seems to be the most common practice for organic guys?
So what I would say is we've had a fairly fundamental shift in the organic sector over the past 2 decades or so, and it's continuing to happen. And that, yes, some of the early adopters were those who were passionate about cropping organically, but they didn't have the support from agronomists, from research. And now that we've got a few decades in of that, so some of the trends we would see is that, the large and successful organic farmers are having fallow periods as infrequently as possible and often never having a full fallow. Whereas, in some of the early days, particularly in some of the drier regions, you could have guys who were wheat fallow, who are essentially modeling a cropping system that was developed in the 30s and bringing it about into the 90s. So one I would say is, the inclusion of much more diverse rotations, a lot more focus on maintaining fertility with looking at green manures and fertility elements of their cropping system. So yes, definitely polycropping is becoming more common, I would say, with some of organic producers as it is with some conventional producers, but our challenges are the same in how do you effectively select the right species, how do you get them in the ground effectively, and how do you separate them effectively. Those are universal challenges, regardless whether you're organic or conventional. The other trend I'm seeing is more producers both embracing some off-farm nutrients where they make sense and where they have strategic need for them. So we're definitely seeing some of that. So the idea that organic is a complete rejection of all products is also not, as I would say, less true than it may perhaps used to be. The idea of producers using nutrients is becoming more and more more widely implemented. I think one of the misconceptions, I'm seeing a lot of organic producers who are running nutrient budgets over their rotation, who are sitting there, who are trying to figure out, if I'm producing 150 pounds of N during my green manure year, how does that nitrogen carry forward for subsequent years, calculating out mineralization, looking at that. If I'm applying, 10 tons of manure this year, how much is it available in this year? What's going to be available in subsequent years? And working through an actual rotation, and then looking at nutrient availability and exports out of that. And I think that's an assumption that many producers would assume, that that no organic farmers are looking at their nutrients, or they're maintaining their soil fertility, or are merely mining their soils. And I think while there is a handful of producers who may be in that subset, there's thankfully more and more producers who are looking at it from a very nuanced perspective of nutrient management for their organic crops. Just their sources of nutrients are different in that case.
Well, there's a core couple of things that I would think we wanted to get to there. And I'm wondering, first of all, I read in the Western Producer recently that really you can pencil out organic crops of almost any kind, and there's some net negative margins out there in organic farming right now.
Currently, yes, absolutely. I would see we've had a fair bit of price erosion. And part of that article really focused on the fact that those who are going to weather this storm are the producers who managed to really focus on their yields and getting their average yields closer towards their conventional neighbors. And if we look globally, there's a handful of examples with certain crops where the organic yields are nearly at or are at the conventional yield averages. But those crops are far and few between, and they're often fairly high input crops on the horticultural side. So some hort crops are actually equaling or exceeding, in a handful of cases, their conventional area averages. Western Canadian grain averages are nowhere near, exceeding or nearing their conventional neighbors. I think if we're moving towards a point where we're achieving 75% of our neighbors' average of our regional average yields, that's a real positive outcome. And many producers are not at 75% of their area average. So with those net margins being, the price per bushel decreasing, or call it the spread between conventional prices and organic prices narrowing, the focus on yields is going to be ever more important, I would say.
Do you think this is a short-term bump in the value of organic crops, or is it a long-term thing?
My feeling is that it's a bit of a short-term bump. That, depending on whom you ask, some would say it's an impact of unfettered exports out of the Black Sea, bringing down the overall North American price. Others would say it's just been a response of the organic producers themselves shifting out of certain crops and into the most profitable ones and overgrowing the market, so that we've got a fairly substantial carry-out of organic wheat that is putting a sort of a downward pressure on the overall market. Part and parcel, we are very much organics is the other misconception, is organics is not just about serving some local farmer's market or some minuscule little mill and a tiny bakery. It is very much a global commodified market. So the impact of pretty negative markets on U.S. organic dairy prices is really putting a pinch onto North Canadian feed grain prices. So because the dairy farmers are having a tough go of it down in Wisconsin, California, and the other regions, that has, impact on the Canadian feed market and the grain market as a whole.
If the situation stays status quo, what are the acreages for organic farmland in Western Canada going to look like in 3 years?
It's an excellent question. I mean, we've had fairly not massive increase in when you look at the number of acres under organic production or the number of organic producers. Yes, they have been growing, but they've not been growing, in my mind, at a rate that exceeded where demand was growing into. Do we see some producers dropping off? Yes, I think if prices remain at this point, if cost of production remain as they are, I think some producers will really have to crunch that number out and say, does it make sense for us to continue with organic production, or should we throw in the towel and move back to conventional farming? There will be some who do that, but I don't see it as a large move because I don't think the pricing scenario we're in now is going to last out for a full 3 years.
How elastic is that demand and supply equation? If you have a number of organic producers drop out, is that immediately going to create more demand and price?
This is one of the great challenges, specifically in the Canadian market, is we really have very little data that we're working with. Precious little data. We have a lot more today than we had 5 years ago, and way more than we had 10 years ago. But whereas in the U.S. market, the USDA actually has contributed and set aside a few $1 million for data collection that allows the organic sector to start to approach some of the knowledge we have in the conventional sector. We don't even begin to have that in Canada. So we don't know what our carryouts are. They're a combination of best guesses and people's work to answer those questions. So demand elasticity is a question I really don't know.
Yeah, I suppose that's why Brenda started Sustainable Grains.
Right. Yes. And similarly, another private company down in the U.S. had kind of also tried to step into the void, because if you don't have a stocks to use number, if you don't have a seeded acres intention, it does make it very challenging to make informed analysis for the sector.
Well, it's a really interesting space to be in, because it's not like things aren't black and white to some degree. I mean, you can't have a little bit of everything on your organic farm in terms of farming between, regenerative and conventional. Is that fair to say? I mean, you have rules and regulations you have to abide by to be certified.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It is a very regulated sort of production system. For anybody who's MO for their farmers, you can't tell me how to farm. I don't recommend farming organically, because it's all about telling you how to farm.
How would you sum up the current regulatory environment as it pertains to organic farming?
I would say in Canada, I'm positive about the scenario. There is the regulatory environment is driven by the sector. It is not driven from the CFIA. It is the sector themselves who get together to run the review of our standards every 5 years. If you, as a producer, don't like an element of our regulatory environment, you can make a strong and convincing case as to why a particular subset of the regulation should be changed. And that goes to the organic sector themselves to, debate it, to discuss it, to come up with a consensus-based decision and either carry it forward or shoot it down. So I think, to me, when I look at our sector, it is still one that is being influenced by primary producers. It's not that, in some areas where you could say that it is driven or taken over by industry, and that it is the industry driving the regulatory environment. I would say it is the whole sector in Canada that is driving and moving our standard forward. I think that's a positive. It's just unfortunately that is a costly process. And up until recently, there was no federal funding for that. So while the regulatory environment in the US was federally funded, the regulatory environment in Europe was federally funded, the regulatory environment in Canada was driven hand to hat by industry, going out to the industry, trying to actually gather the funds to have the meetings, to sit down, to negotiate this out. And it's only recently that we actually had some federal funding to actually do that review of our regulations. And now, so Canadian producers are competing head to head in a global marketplace with European exporters, with US exporters, and yet we're not operating under an equivalent regulatory environment when it comes to that funding for the sector. That is one of the challenges.
That's a pretty cool narrative, though, for anybody in the circular economy or not. Organic farming, by the growers for the growers, right? Like it's less and less in our industry that there's big groups like that govern overall system that are still fully producers only and not run by some big overheading, corporation or organization of some sorts. I think that's a really cool narrative about that.
It is. And yet, and it's not to say that there should not be a place for grain traders or input suppliers in the organic sector. There absolutely are. There needs to be. And they need to have a voice at the table. We just need to make sure that it is one of many voices at the table, that there is a voice for the poultry sector, a voice for the dairy sector, a variety of, of other sectors within sort of the cropping systems, that those producers and regions are represented.
Are there aspects of the regulatory environment in organic farming that you think would behoove the conventional agriculture sector to adopt in order to better reach consumers or food processors?
So, we're probably at a bit of a crossroads where consumers of all sorts are looking to understand how food meets what their values are. They may have a variety of different values. And I think the ability to communicate clearly about how you are producing and what you are producing is something that is important, regardless whether you are a producer who views that the integration of, agriculture 5.0, where we see that synthesis of soil fertility, biotechnology, data, and information as the right way to go, whether your producer views grass-finished cattle as the right way to go, or whether your producer views organic production as the right way to go. Not saying that any one of those is right or the wrong way. What I see the opportunity is that consumers know when they purchase an organic product in Canada that's produced to the Canadian organic standards, that it meets an absolute ironclad set of production principles that is clear and easy to know. Whereas, there are some sustainability metrics out there where I think are very vague and very unclear as to what their goals and their outcomes are. And I think being able to be a little more defined about how the products are being produced would benefit all elements of the sector. So, if there was a definition that, this grass-finished cattle or grass-fed cattle was done using set of systems X, Y, and Z, and you knew that X, Y, and Z were in place without question, without a doubt, that consistency is something I think we could gain from.
So beyond the regulatory environment for organic farming, you mentioned values. What would you describe the core values of organic farmers as being?
I actually don't know that there is a core set of values. I honestly don't know how to answer that. And again, by way of explanation, for a number of years, I worked as an organic inspector, which meant that I was on the grounds coming out to verify the farms. Are you complying with the regulations? The one thing I found was that the sector is as diverse in terms of its motivators, its values, as any other element in the agriculture sector. I found very little consistency in terms of the drivers as to why producers were farming the way they were farming. And that was an eye-opening and interesting element to see, that it was very broad in terms of their motivators, values, or drivers.
So what would the core values on your organic operation be?
Okay, there, that's different.
Thank you, Greg.
So for our farm, they're very committed for us to be trying to innovate, that they want to see us use new technologies, new ideas, and new products, not innovation for the sake of innovation itself, but innovation that addresses some of the challenges that are out there. Can we innovate to find ways to ensure that soil fertility in the long run for organic productions is a sustainable and long-term solution? Can we address issues related to carbon sequestration on our farm? So core values are very much driven by environmental stewardship as one of the core values, innovation that looks to be on the cutting edge of practices and or concepts. And then, like every other farm, that it's got to pencil out and pay for itself. That we have to find a way to do that is still economically profitable and sustainable. Because if it is both addressing environmental concerns, both being productive and profitable, then it also means that we could show a positive example that other producers may want to emulate and continue to try and grow our sector, and have more producers adapting some of the practices or going full-scale organic production. I'm blessed that I've got an ownership of this farm who are very firmly committed to doing the right thing in a way and trying to move forward. Some of our experiments are bound to fail, but that is the nature of experimentation. Hopefully we can collaborate with other producers so we don't replicate their failures, so that we can try to share some of that knowledge. And I think that is an element in the ag sector that really is exciting right now, that I think we see more producers finding technological ways to share and also expressing greater willingness to share. That your failures are not merely hidden in the back 40 and buried away, and hopefully nobody ever discusses them at the coffee. A group of producers as part of the system or something else where, your failures are shared, your successes are shared, your books are shared, your profitability is shared, that with the right people, you could be open and transparent and work together and collaborate so that all of our operations can be better in a myriad of different ways.
I'm fascinated by the organic community. Would you say that there's a completely different vibe amongst organic producers and how they organize and share information and get together versus other forms of farming? Is there a special bond? Is there a club? Do you got a tattoo in some place we can't see that says organic?
The first rule of the club is, not to talk about the club. So
nice. Tip of the hat to one of my favorite movies of all time, Fight Club. Well done.
It is interesting because, again, I had the real pleasure of being able to go out to such a variety of different farms, and some farms who were fairly new into entering into organics. And I did find that a number of producers said that they felt that producers were more willing to share some of the information because perhaps it was maybe less proprietary, that there were very few magic elixirs or products that were necessarily driving success, and that some of it was more about concepts and ideas. So maybe you're more willing to share conceptual ideas that aren't going to look the same on a different person's farm than you are on your own farm. That if your producers found, I'm seeing a real benefit from having green manure frequency of every 3 years as compared to every 4 years, and here's my reasons why, that more producers could adopt into that sort of a system or be willing to share some of that. But I think what's most exciting for me is seeing the collaboration that I see is growing more and more now. There's a lot of conventional farms I'm going to that I am blown away by their practices from a sustainability perspective, from a production standpoint. There's less of a division of us and them and more of a opportunity of what do we all have to learn from each other? How do we all have practices or ideas that will make our operations, will make them more successful? And so I'm really excited in that I see less of a division between the two, conventional and organic, and never shall they meet. It's nothing about that at all anymore. I think there's a lot more opportunity for us to kind of share ideas and learn. And that's an exciting time, I think, in agriculture overall.
Is there a model where business entities go back and forth across the threshold? They're transitioning. I just see that might be a functional part. I know there's a 3-year gap to get certified, but I know I have a couple people that I know personally that have actually run the life cycle of their organic farm. And this spring, one's at Rivers, Manitoba, and one's in southeastern Saskatchewan. They're both going to be pouring on the coal with fertilizer and spraying chemical. They just can't handle the 10 bushels to the acre anymore, and maybe the financials have changed. But I thought it was interesting. It made me wonder: is there a timeline on this being organic? And could you go back and cycle some of your acres, replenish the nutrients, and go back into organic, or is that totally off the map?
The standard the regulatory environment actually tried to sort of address that, particularly on the short term, which really kind of Canadian rule is pretty clear and straightforward on it. Land shall not be alternated between conventional and organic production methods. Whatever the standard specific requirement was, that might not be verbatim, but that is the intent. So it really becomes challenging for a producer. I mean, certainly in the short term, you couldn't just farm organically for 3 years, put it into alfalfa, spray it out, put it into alfalfa, fertilize, top it all up on your fertilizer profile, then bring it back in 3 years later. The standard's really clear on saying, no, you can't do that. Now, if it was occurring over a generational time frame that, dad quit farming organically, but now the kids wanted to take it on, would the standard apply then? Maybe not, because it's under different management. But right now, the standard would say, or the Canadian regulatory environment would say, no, you can't bring her back and forth. You can't, switch between that. I mean, my father, when I was trying to convince him to go organic, I was on the threshold of getting him to go there. We had the paperwork filled out. Things had been very different from when I talked about the ideas in the early 90s. It was now nearly 2 decades later, 15 years later. I knew the markets, knew the agronomy. I said, Dad, this is time for us to do it. You'd be a great fit. And then he pulled the plug. I was like, Dad, what? What happened here? We had the paperwork filled out. We were all set to go. And he said to me one of those moments that was pure madness and pure genius at the same time. He said to me, son, you cannot be both a Jew and a Muslim at the same time. Which is always madness.
I love your dad voice too. This is great. I love your dad stories. We all learned a lot from our dads, didn't we?
We did, yes. And yet, as much as they say it was madness, because there is examples of tons and many, many farms that have part of their operation that's producing organically, part of it's producing conventionally. They've found a system that makes it work for them, how they segregate the two farms. They've got different storage areas. They've got, different equipment yards, whatever it may be. They've found ways to do it that regulatory fits out and makes logical sense for their operations. And some of those are very successful in doing that. And they have no moral conundrum between having their two production systems. They said, yeah, we have two production systems. One production system does this, the other production system does that. It's not a conundrum.
So why were you trying to convince your father to farm organically? Why farm organic?
For him, I think it made sense because of the size of his farm. If you cannot grow your acres in an environment where land prices are escalating, or perhaps you have no desire to increase your land base, if you can have greater profit per acre, that is a way to increase your overall farm profitability without getting involved in that chasing, the next quarter section and outbidding your neighbor in the process. So I would say if you look at it fundamentally, economically, year over year, across Canada in other regions, organic production systems have a lower cost of production and a greater gross profit per acre, leading to greater ROI. So if you're only farming 1,200 acres and you can't grow your acres, then going organic is a way to increase the profit on that farm.
I want to present you with the 3 stereotypes I have about organic farmers, and I want you to respond. So in my experience, there's essentially 3 different types of organic farmers. The first is the individual has had some negative experience with chemical, right? You talk to them and why did you go organic? Well, 10 years ago, I got really sick with pesticides and I just thought about what am I doing to my system and my crops and environment and whatever else, right? But they're pretty reasonable about it. They just they couldn't deal with it. They were sensitive to chemical, or they literally just had to stop working with that stuff and they wanted to keep farming. So they became organic. The second group, I would say, is a bit fanatical, and they have all kinds of conspiracy theories about big pharma and big agriculture and the evil inputs. And I'm not giving my money to those guys, and I'm going to rebel, and I've hacked the matrix and yada, yada, yada. And then when they get up and talk at presentations, everybody starts to cringe because essentially we should be throwing conventional farmers into some sort of purgatory where they'll burn in hell forever because of their farming practices. And you're wondering, was the free donuts worth it? The third is, you've been there? The third is rational men and women who look at this agronomically, financially, logistically, and just as a thing that people are asking for in business. And they're asked, they look at it and what does the customer want and what can we make money at? And if that's what the world wants, let's do it. And let's do it. I mean, I consider yourself in the third category. You seem incredibly rational and well-spoken and highly educated, far beyond my means and all that good stuff. I mean,
I took my tinfoil hat off before the interview.
You got good enough hair for this podcast, but is that fair to say? Do you find running in those in these organic peer groups that's a fair assessment or something to be debunked?
Well, they are fairly. I've encountered all 3 of those groups. Within.
They do exist.
Going up, so they do definitely exist. They are. Yes, they're not the unicorns of the ag world. There's, I would say there's a 4th group that I found were thankfully increasingly less of a portion of the sector. They were the farmers who are already using half rates or pretty on the fringe of inputs. So they realized that if they simply just went from half rates to no rates, that they would get a price premium. But generally, because they were not thinking about their business model and they were not thinking about their overall success, they bailed themselves out of business. So there's less and less of them out there. Or maybe they also realized that they actually had to get more into camp 3 and start applying best management practices in order to address their operations. Because there was an adage that I have often used and I still agree with. There was never one example yet that I've seen where a poor farmer became a good farmer by taking away tools out of their toolbox. The only where I looked at the successful organic farmers, they're the ones who are still approaching the same mindset about how do we strive for success? How do we try to improve on last year's mistakes? How do we make the operation better? How do we find a right how do we find the right markets for our products? How do we, all of those same elements that successful conventional farmers are doing, the successful organic farmers are doing, because they have a mindset towards continual improvement, and they have a mindset towards trying to learn and educate and trying to improve their operations and grow their operations, be that physically or economically or ecologically. They may be also trying to just do that on that front as well. I don't know what the relative ratio of those 3 or 4 sectors are.
Yeah, I want the pie chart.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
It will be curious, though, because I think when you look towards growing a sector, there are no more farmers who are philosophically inclined towards transitioning to organic.
Say that again.
The producers who are philosophically inclined towards growing organic. Now, I mean, you're in those 3 categories. Mm-hmm. Philosophically, maybe the sort of the perhaps the more rabid bunch. They may be more in the category 1, where they had an adverse impact. But those who are, if you look, because again, this is where a bit of my interest in stats goes, and a bit of my interest in a sector goes. In order for organic production to grow beyond 1 or 2% of the sector, it must be economically viable. It must appeal to producers in a broader group. So if we're going to grow the sector, who are those producers who are going to be target audiences? And so in that, and I've had the benefit of kind of sitting in some of the groups that were looking at, where do we target new farmers coming in? So part of that target was young, educated farmers who are young farmers coming back from university or ag college or another part of the industry, who are in their late 20s, early 30s. They do not have the ability to scale up the farm to the capital required to get into the, to go head to head, as I say, in that competition for land and competition for equipment. Those producers are a great potential fit for new entrants to the organic sector, because if you can have a profitable farm on a fraction of the acreage, it makes it feasible for you to get a head start.
Right.
That's a great person you want to have in your sector, because they're going to be willing to, to innovate. They're going to be willing to try and be successful, and they've got lots of energy. They're young farmers. That's a great target audience. Who are those target audiences? And so or I say we don't have any more who are philosophically inclined. They have to be those who are inclined for other reasons. Mm-hmm. So we have to be, having growth in the sector coming from farmers who see it as a viable business opportunity, who see it as a viable production system. That's part of the challenge.
On growing that, when you're targeting, that specific niche of farmers or your ideal target farmer, on the actual farming side of things, is there a specific soil zone or temperate geography that favors organic farming versus conventional? Is that something that's ever thought about?
It is curious, because right now, if we had, a map that showed all of the acres under organic production in Western Canada, we could answer that question better. And that map does not exist. But I've had the opportunity to say, going out to hundreds of different farms. Traditionally, most of the organic acre has been on some of the more marginal land. And that's because it allowed farmers to be profitable on land that was not as productive. You don't see as many organic acres on some of the premium land across Western Canada. So it is interesting, if you look towards, that yield gap, we're trying to have an average yield that is being grown generally on less than ideal land compared to provincial average that includes land that is on ideal land. So I think it makes an unfair statistical comparison. So we are starting to see some shift, though. I'm seeing organic acres down in the fertile, beautiful garden area down in, Carmen Winkler in southern Manitoba, where land prices are ludicrously There's an interesting example of a split operation where they had used to transition their poorest pieces of lands into organic. And after a number of years in, when they looked at crunch their numbers and looked at the system and looked at their improving yields and looked at their profitability, they said, this is madness. Why are we putting our worst land into organic? We need to be putting our best land into organic. So now they're transitioning their best quality dirt into their organic acres as they grow that section of their operation.
You're talking about our friends at Eli.
I will not even discuss which friends we're talking about. Confidentiality is important. Confidentiality.
Yeah, I was going to say their name, but I didn't think that'd be appropriate. But what do you think about farming 40,000 acres of organic, Stuart?
Scale is still feasible for organic producers, but there is a much underestimated increase in labor. If you're going to try and go out and cover your fields using a mechanical in-crop weed control unit that at best is 60 feet wide and might need a couple of passes to get effective weed control, that is a lot different manpower than having one sprayer operator with a 120-foot boom. Mathematically, you need more labor. So I think that is a fundamental challenge of how do you do 40,000 acres and ensure that your labor is well managed and that you have enough labor to make that work. That's definitely a question we're grappling with on our farm. What is the right number of people to the farm where you don't want to over commit, but at the same time, if you don't get the people on board for the start of the season, how do you have them for, how do you realize in July when you realize you needed more hands, then the hands are all gone? It's not so easy.
Well, and you need a bigger farm now because everybody has to stand 6 feet apart.
Right, of course. Yes.
But that was literally the reason that my friend stopped farming farming organic in southeast Saskatchewan was one of the reasons, because she spent the entire summer cultivating.
Aha. Yes. So I do think that management on the human resource side is a underestimated challenge for doing organic at scale. Again, I think that's, one of the opportunities. If you don't have a large land base, it's like, okay, great. Then you can get your, people over that acres effectively over the growing season then. And have it still pencil out and have it, work for that size. But man, oh man, I know I did take farm ownership when I said, if we want to grow from 5,000 to 10,000, that's one thing. To grow from 10,000 to 20, 30, 40, you don't know how complex that gets. I do not want to manage a 40,000 acre farm. I'm not that guy.
Nope. You're managing people, not a farm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually like my tractor time. I like my time out on the tractor. I like my time in the field. I have time shoveling out dirty bins, and that's part of the farm. And so I wouldn't want to be 100% a manager of people. And I think it's just a complexity for me. It's not my inclination, but we obviously have an example here in Western Canada of, farms of that size. We have a new farm coming on board in South Dakota that's that size. I mean, there's some farms in Australia that are vastly larger than that, but yeah, they skew the data because they've just got stupid amounts of grazing land for organic cattle. And so, yeah, there's a few million acre farms in Australia, but they're not in the same ballpark.
Right. So talking about scale, what if everybody went organic? Would it still be organic? I mean, could you still get $35 for a bushel of flax or not?
Mm.
You hear that all the time, right? Like, oh, we can't feed the world if we're organic. If everybody went organic, there'd be no premium. I mean, is this true?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways to look into that. Every farmer knows, the cost of a $3 loaf of bread that's in the grocery store. What's the farmer's cut on that? 5 cents, 4 cents, 6 cents?
Yeah.
So if my organic cost was double the conventional one, so I've got 8 cents, 10 cents, 12 cents in that loaf of bread in terms of ingredient cost. So we do have a bit of a disconnect between the bushel price at the farm gate versus the ingredient value at the consumer end. And I think that, on the organic side, it sometimes is less pronounced between that disconnect between the producer price and the final retail price. The food question, now you're getting into some of the more interesting questions and assumptions out there. Yeah, if we already grow more than enough food to feed every person on the world many times over right now, but we still have hunger, increasing production isn't going to mean that there's more or less hungry people.
We only have to look at what's happening right now, Stuart, with the COVID crisis, because of restaurants shutting down, because of different the change in behavior on how we're eating food. It's highlighting the level of food waste, because there's more food waste occurring right now in this crisis than ever before, because the food that was getting manufactured for that sector is essentially useless, and milk's getting thrown out, and different food that would go into the restaurants now are getting thrown out. So it highlights, this crisis is physically highlighted the level of food waste and has been exacerbated by it.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, we're starting to see some of those images coming out of dairy producers dumping their milk, and and this is really going to pose some critical questions for certain sectors in agriculture. I mean, hearing about farmers who really tried to address that food waste issue and grow directly and foster links directly with restaurants, and now those restaurants are shut down. And their whole marketing system was growing produce to work directly with restaurants that were working directly with eaters. And now that whole system's thrown in. How do they shift their gears to start wholesale producing vegetables? I don't know. There's a lot of questions those sorts of producers are going to face. I mean, it feels, as a grain producer, we're not nearly as challenged with some of those questions that are happening right now. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate disparity between different elements of the agriculture sector in Canada right now. We're not facing an equal degree of challenge.
True that. One of the more interesting things I've heard is that bread makers are at a premium. They're a very hard thing to find, along with toilet paper, and that a certain retailer of organic flour has been experiencing a lot of high demand in this time. People want to produce their own stuff. I mean, even if it's just a bread maker in the corner of your house.
No, absolutely. And it is curious, though, reading of some of the milling demand for home use skyrocketing to the typical levels that they'd see in September and December. But then obviously at the same time, I don't want to call it industrial bread, but, grocery store bread sales would be down. So all of the, large scale baking flour needs would be taking a hit. So are we at a net neutral point? I don't know that question. I know I've been really happy about the increase in baking in our house lately, personally. So,
thumbs up.
Fresh cinnamon buns, sourdough buns, bread of all sorts. I'm pretty thrilled.
Seeing your buns show up on social media like never before.
Yes. Yeah.
So, Stuart, one of the biggest things I wanted to tackle and get your response on here is an article from the Western Producer, and I put you at an unfair disadvantage. It's kind of funny because, obviously I should have maybe sent this to you ahead of time, but I'm sure you can handle it on your feet here. It's kind of funny because I Googled it as we were doing this podcast and I found it, which is really handy. But in my presentations as a guy who's flogging fertility, I have at various times stood up and said, you know what, guys? And it's a very kind of simple, rudimentary argument. And like you say, there's all kinds of nuances and 50 shades of gray in the, I don't know if we should use that term, 50 shades of gray in the organic community. But anyways, it speaks to the environmental impact and the biology of farming organically. And I'll share you this article, but I've got up before and I've talked about, hey, guess what? I saw some research in the Western Producer in Saskatchewan that intimated that in organic farming systems, there isn't enough nutrients to get that biological process going in the soil. And we talk about this all the time. And so, in fact, something that we think, it's like a pet peeve I have with civilization, something that we think is supposed to be environmentally friendly, or as you say, consumers are buying into just because of the warm fuzzy, but does it really have less environmentally impact than us evil convention producers that are pouring on 140 pounds of nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process? God bless Haber-Bosch process, because a lot of people would have starved really hardcore in the early 1900s without that. But I guess two-part question really to this is how environmentally friendly is organic relative to conventional in your estimation? And then what do you really, I'm getting your photo, I want getting your video up here so you can see my screen here on this.
Yep.
I found this so fascinating, Stuart. This was done in Saskatchewan, talking about starved organic soils erode soil organic matter versus conventional. So the fundamental thrust of this article was that without enough nutrients in the soil, you can't get that biological process going. And because we're exporting nutrients off the soil every year, there's a net export occurring. And at some point, the microbial activity in the soil breaks down with the lack of nutrients. And I started to wonder if the organic, like the natural biological systems in the soil aren't really working, and there's not enough nutrition getting into the plant or the soil for it really to have a healthy biome. I mean, it's similar to your own guts. How environmentally friendly is this? And I mean, this is just some of my very rudimentary takeaways from me, like a 5-year-old, because I'm not a scientist and maybe not fair to throw this article at you, but is organic more environmentally friendly than conventional? And what is happening with the biology in your system, farming in your organic systems?
It's an interesting idea that if you have one crop producing 25 bushels of wheat and the other crop producing 70 bushels of wheat, the volume of biomass, just the straight amount of roots, the amount of stem, the amount of leaves, yes, there is more grain that left the conventional system than volume of grain and nutrients contained in that grain on the organic side that left the system. But obviously, the conventional system had its nutrients, all of its nutrients met, but the volume of carbon coming back into the soil would be greater because there was just simply more crop. So I'm very interested in Bobby's work. I've had a chance to kind of chat with her a little bit about it, not because I feel offended that it is an attack on my sector, but I see it as a call to action. I see it as a call to action to try and understand the challenges that were being addressed there, to see, is it an irreversible issue? Well, then the entire fundamentals of organic production has significant problems, massive problems. But what I've come to the conclusion, it is not an irreversible issue. The reason why is Dr. Helgeson was very clear in saying their experimental basis did not include any interventions. If you or I were producing in a way that we realized was failing, it was failing to produce yields, it was failing to produce the crops, we would take interventions. We wouldn't continue to follow, that definition of insanity of doing the same thing year after year after year and expecting a different result. Unfortunately, a scientific experiment that was designed to look at certain parameters or certain, sort of factors and certain questions cannot change its production system. So she's very clear in saying that, there were no interventions. There have been similar work that was done at the U of M looking at their long-term organic rotations, which is great. It's one of Canada's longest running, in fact, it is Canada's longest running comparison of organic and conventional side by side. After 15 years, there too were realizing the system was falling apart. The system was falling apart from phosphorus reductions. The system was falling apart from a couple of other nutrients as well. So they actually had an intervention. They said, all right, we have a problem. Hey, maybe we should try to address the problem. If we're having a problem with phosphorus depletion, not only in the top 0 to 6 inch, but the 6 to 12, and then the 12 down to, I think they looked all the way down to 48. They looked at like subsurface depths, and they saw depletion across the profile. Well, let's address it. So they implemented what would arguably be a very modest addition of, composted cattle manure. Certainly not enough to be at replacement levels when you do a classic removal replacement calculation, but it still transformed the system and started fixing it. So to come to your question of is organic more sustainable, I am obliged by my farm owners to say yes, it is. But I also would say is that poorly managed organic farms are going to have negative externalities in the same way poorly managed conventional farms are. If you want to compare ideal management under one system and terrible management on the other, that's not an apples to apples comparison. All systems have the capacity to be managed well, to have producers who are responsive to change, who are looking for the source of the problem, who are trying to correct it, and we're going to seek to, make sure that their farm operation is as successful as possible. But if we don't have that, we will, of course, have all sorts of problems that are going to come from this. Absolutely, without a question, without a doubt.
Well said, my friend.
Did I get close to answering it?
He's a pretty eloquent dude, eh, Greg?
Yeah, I think you've been able to shed some light on the organic sector for a lot of people, including Dan and myself. Definitely answered some question I had. And I think it's really interesting, the comparisons that can be drawn between conventional and organic, when I think all too often people separate them as being so vastly different, when I think fundamentally from the way you've put it out to us, we could draw a lot of comparisons.
It is curious. And I mean, I'm finding tremendous challenge and opportunity now managing this farm, particularly over some fields that have been under organic management for a couple of decades now. But I'm trying to piece together the yields and the crop rotation based on records and talking with people. So of course, you don't end up having a full history of how lands have been managed. But thankfully, the record-keeping requirement of organics has allowed me to go back and at least parse together a 10-year rotational history and some yield data and whatnot. But I'm finding the opportunity is that the learning lessons never end. I had thought that we would be able to use biology and plants to bring our soils back into health. Some of my challenging fields, I have not been able to do that. So I'm now starting to kind of realize that we cannot use biology and plants alone to fix the problems, that we need to, so hence, soil testing on it, hence off-farm nutrients that were being brought in. And we're really going to have to start looking towards a plan that addresses soil fertility with a series of different of systems that we're, and I don't know the answers yet. I'm still definitely working on them, and I hope to find the solutions. But so far, the status quo was absolutely not working, and the revision using a heavy emphasis of biology was not working. So we'll have to revise yet again.
Just to wrap things up here and give you the final word on a kind of a meaningful note, what does it mean to you to be in such an essential service during this pandemic, which is affecting almost everybody on planet Earth right now?
Yeah, it's a very interesting time because I feel that as producers, we seem to be more valued than in past, as are the truck drivers and the cleaners and everybody else keeping the food production plants going. I don't think it is a time for anybody in agriculture to overstate their importance, and I don't think anybody was. We're still continuing day in, day out to do what we always did. We'll still be, lining up our fuel, our inputs, our seed to get this year's crop in the ground. We're still going forward. Calving season is still happening on every other farm, on all the farms who've got calves coming out right now. We're all still moving ahead. What the challenge will be is for me, I'm just fearful that in the efforts to meet social distancing, that some of the industries that are essential for agriculture get hit in the crossfire. If somehow the tire store was deemed as a non-essential service, I'd be in dire straits because we don't have, much in the way of tire repairs at the best of times. And if I blow out a tire and need to get a tube put in the midst of seeding, I need that tube put in. I need the replacement. I need help on those sorts of things. Yes, fertilizer and fuel and the food handling and processing facilities were all viewed correctly as essential. Farms as essential. What's the other side of it? If, the hardware stores or some of those supply stores. So we don't have the ability in agriculture to put things on hold and start in July. We cannot. If the crop doesn't go in the ground when the crop needs to grow in the ground, the whole season is lost. So there is a different imperative that we work with.
How are you guys addressing COVID as a business up there?
Where I guess the principal thing was trying to look towards where some of our vulnerabilities were. We don't have a lot of, off-farm service providers, and those who we have already inputted their own measures. So I feel safe on that. I think one of the things that for us was part of the step was looking towards the parts that we would have waited until they were broken to go get, and tried to ensure that anything, if it is broken, the past 2 seeding seasons, that we have spares on hand, that we're not going to make the assumption that we could have it within 24 hours or less than 24 hours and just drive down to our farm equipment parts supplier. So we better make assurances that we get those supplies on farm now. And if we never even use them in the whole season, oh well, that was just part of the cost of being prepared this year. Sad part is we're sucking a lot more dust cleaning bins because dust masks aren't available for anybody who would use the dust mask for on-farm use. So steady supply of black Kleenex to blow all the dust out of your nose because you can't stop it going in anymore.
Nasty. Yeah. What do you think's been the most valuable, or what are you most passionate about what you've done with your career, or even going forward in agriculture? What gets you really super, super excited in the morning?
What's been, I guess, if I try to think it down, the one thing that's gotten me really excited was seeing the innovation that agriculture has and continues to bring forward. Innovation at the producer level, people coming up with solutions to the challenges that they're being faced by. And it's something that I never grow tired of, and something that always gets me excited towards seeing how we continue to adapt what is arguably, one of this, oldest professions that has gone through so many countless changes, but is still continuing to be new. And I think that's been the fun part when you look at the people who are still excited and active in agriculture, who refuse to retire, who are well into their 70s or 80s, who are still excited about agriculture. It seems that that's one of the common threads that excites them as well. That growth, that innovation, that change. And to me, that's one of the really exciting parts that keeps me going as well.
We're very excited about that too. Very excited about that in our company and the industry. And I would concur. It is never a boring affair being in agriculture, and it's just going to get a lot more interesting as we go. So, Stuart, thanks so much for taking time out of your precious day and spending with us to enlighten us about organic farming, and you handled everything like a champ. You're very well spoken. I think you're a great champion of the agricultural industry in general, not to pick sides about who's right or wrong in what they're doing. I think you have the right approach, and I think you're highly enlightened in that regard. And do you have any comments before we sign off, Greg?
No, I think you exactly what Dan said there. You shined a great light on, both comparisons, and you weren't picking sides. And I can see the passion you have for organic. If we're going to be specific, and for your farm and the practices you do, and all across our province and Western Canada. Thanks for coming on today, Stuart. It's an awesome conversation.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to be on Grow in the Future podcast. Great having a chat with both of you today. Been a pleasure, and looking forward to tuning in and listening to more podcasts in the future.